So obviously, as I have mentioned, that you can expect 50% of sport horses to have some form of compensatory gait, some restriction, as I like to put it, but we'll cover that more in a future presentation in more detail. If there's an inappropriate horse rider weight ratio, and again that's something you need to tackle and we'll talk about in a future presentation, you should not be supplying saddles readily knowing that you are going to cause welfare and well-being issues. But again, it's a very sensitive issue, and my first response has in the past been, well, if that horse or pony has got a really good home, then you can't exactly say pass that horse or pony on because it's not suitable for you. And then the pony is cast off to the great horse owning wilderness. So that's something that triggers or can trigger my sense of responsibility and accountability to that animal. But there are ways of working with the combination that could do better, and there is now a growing trend for rider accountability in terms of the social license of acceptability that we should even be on their backs at all. So that's getting easier. If the horse is poorly conditioned, so that if a saddle is fitted to this development, this poor development, this obvious situation where there could be better development, unless the horse is older, then it may be more difficult to put condition and muscle on them. But you know what's going to happen if you fit a saddle to this development or lack of it. It's not going to work. It's not going to do the horse any favours. The horse may be worked and worked to build condition, and if the saddle is not able to accommodate that, then what you may see is the outline of a saddle in the horse's back, exactly where it sits. You could argue that if you had a good rider, or a skilled rider, who's knowledgeable about fitting and conditioning horses, you could argue that your very well fitting saddle will improve the horse. But unless you're really sure about that, and it's your area of expertise to know that, then there's more chance of the saddle not improving the top line of the horse. So if you feel like you should supply a saddle, you are going to have to return to that saddle more frequently to make sure that it is working, so that you can prevent a complaint or prevent the client from having made a purchase mistake in the future. If the horse is too weak and or requiring other intervention, and this links with being poorly conditioned, and I have seen it argued that, well, if you, with your expertise, do not supply this type of horse with a saddle, then somebody else, lesser qualified, perhaps more committed to selling than considering what could go wrong, that it's better if you do it. But there are ways to handle this situation so that you can remain involved and maintain your standards of equine welfare and well-being. And if you're unable to supply the horse-rider combination with a saddle that fits both of them, and this is becoming more and more of an issue as we learn more and more about the true fit of a saddle to the rider. So that's about thinking what you should do if you genuinely are unable to supply them. What you may do is consult your network of other fitters and come up with a solution. And again, that looks really good if you are seen by your client to be doing that, to be helping them, because after all, you and your network are the experts. They want a saddle, so you may not have to walk away, but certainly if you can't fit both of them adequately, then you shouldn't fit. It's only going to cause a problem or serious injury to the rider at some point. As I said, in that case you would refer to others, but you could still stay involved. So if you're unable to provide your usual high level of service or fitting protocol cannot be completed. So what that means is you shouldn't compromise your usual high standards of your fitting protocol or some other aspect of your service. So for example, if you find yourself in a situation where that it's too challenging to provide a saddle because you don't have the right conditions, or you have a muddy field or a horse that won't stand still because the weather is poor, it's raining, it's windy, it's almost dark, then you're going to have to set up a different set of conditions somehow. Very often those clients can bring their horses to a local facility. Even if they have to pay for it, they can bring their horse to a local facility for you to fit. And that is important to find out in advance, that you should screen the client so that when you arrive there are not some conditions that will prevent you from providing your usual high level of service. Otherwise you risk getting it wrong. And there's no harm in explaining that to the client, because they don't always know what you're going to do. They just think you're going to, or some of them think that supplying a saddle is a very straightforward process.
And just to say that I'm sure most of you would probably have that information on your website, a set of advanced instructions there that your clients can read, just to make the conditions as good as they can be for you and for them.
Or if you have unusual requests that might compromise your standards. The difficult, needy client, with those cases, if you have built a good network, then you should be able to refer them. But if you have poor client compliance, so if you've given them one set of instructions and recommendations and they just won't follow it.
I just want to add there that compliance very much relates to the explanations that you give them. So if they've got a problem, you've got to identify that problem and then find a solution and explain the solution. So it does involve a bit of spoon feeding and a bit of extra time. Some people don't listen because the information that goes in the ears is not taken on board. So those people, you might have a video that you refer them to, give them a link to a video, or again, if we're going to create some leaflets, then they may need a leaflet. So it's just a matter of perhaps building up a library of information and finding out, is your client more visual? Do they like looking at videos? Would they prefer an A4 sheet of paper with words on it? Because compliance is very important, and it's very difficult sometimes to get people to comply with your recommendations, but it's not impossible.
Online sales. It's difficult to, unless you are confident that the saddle will fit and that there won't be a problem, or that perhaps the client wants to try a saddle and you'll be back to fit, whatever. The internet is, or can be, a real problem that clients can obtain saddles so easily. If there's a threat to your reputation, so if you sense that client can do harm in some way, well, indirectly, they don't set out to harm you. So for example, if you did fit a saddle to a horse that you suspected was not ready for that saddle fit, and that person does not call you back, then that could threaten your reputation, because if that horse changes shape in the future, and let's face it, if you've done a good job, for many horses they will have changed shape because they're moving differently, because you've improved them. But if there are situations where you've supplied a saddle and it could be a threat to your reputation, you're going to need to put some thought into that. So obviously the answer is you must go back. You must insist that you go back. You must try to guide that client into doing the right thing. So these are all things that you need to consider, which I'm sure many of you, most of you, all of you do. But if you're new to this, then I can tell you that the landscape is fraught with all sorts of clients, consumers, with a very different set of individual motivations, as I said earlier. They walk among us, and we walk among them. So what can you do? I have gone through some of these aspects already. You can suggest a plan. So I know that many of our members are true horse saddle rider practitioners, and they will sail through this because they're able to give some equine therapy or rider assessment or some equitation coaching. So those are the saddle fitters with those skills who really can help their clients. And if you do have that level of expertise, then in terms of consumer client compliance, they will be willing to listen to you. Your plan will be justified and compelling to them. You can support and monitor the situation. So even if you have to refer them for therapy, you can come back, or you can at least keep a dialogue open. Call them every couple of weeks and say, how are you getting on? Do you think you might be ready for a saddle fit yet? Or does your coach think you're ready, or your vet, or whoever? And then you'll be available to help them. Remember, 50% have compensatory gait, potentially. And if you can recognise that and prevent a welfare issue from occurring, then those owners, riders who really do care for their animals will really appreciate what you have to say. You can schedule a no obligation return. So that's a very compelling offer. So you get there and you discover that you perhaps don't feel comfortable with fitting that saddle. Just schedule another appointment and don't charge for it. See what you can do. Because sometimes those with the more challenging cases, even though you don't want it to turn into a complaint, obviously, if they get a good outcome, they will be very willing to do some selling and advertising for you. Again, that's not intended as a second opinion on another fitter's fit. Again, you can attend the referral sessions. That's another way of keeping yourself in or on the radar, that if the client does have to have the veterinarian to look at the compensation restriction that you have pointed out, just nip back and get involved. Just find out firsthand what the other professional's input has been and see if you can assist, because in nearly all cases horses do need saddles. They just may not need them, or it may not be right for them to have one at that time. So you can stay on the radar for when it is the right time. And just going back to what Jackie Dark, the solicitor, stated, that There are many complaints that come in where a new saddle has been supplied. The horse was already having issues that perhaps were not spotted, or the client may have thought that the old saddle was a problem and that a new one would make all the difference, which it can temporarily, but if the horse has got residual issues, it will just break at a later point. So many complaints are that do reach the solicitors, the courts, are centred on horses that fail or break, and the client thinks it's due to the saddle, the expensive saddle, and they're going to really fight for a refund because they can no longer ride the horse, or they may not be able to ride it for some time, and their initial reaction is, I want a refund, I'm going to get one, I'll see if that's a possibility. So you may well be able to prevent that type of complaint just by being there when the veterinarian visits. So well worth doing, and again, it's free CPD. We pay lots of money for our CPD in general, but what better CPD could you have than to learn from the client's, the horse's vet? You can gather more information to help with formulating an action plan. So you might need to get more history, you might need to see them ride, you might need to see the videos that they've made. So just getting more information can help you decide whether or not to sell a saddle or whether to instead formulate an action plan. You have to, as I said earlier, nurture and protect your reputation. And we all want to go out there and help the horse. None of us wants to turn our back on needy horses, but there are ways to still help. And in fact, yes, if you do walk away and another fitter does step into your place, well, in many ways you may be facilitating that welfare issue. So I think based on your professional expertise, you should perhaps put more effort into staying around and being involved for a bit longer, because that might be the best way to help rather than to supply a saddle on that day because the client wants one. You can share your anonymised images or case studies them in my Learn Saddle Fitting group on Facebook. Although I don't encourage does my saddle fit type of posts, it's absolutely fine for saddle fitters to post in there as long as they can anonymise their images and videos. So that's an option as well. Again, it's more information gathering, you're reaching out to a network, potentially coming up with a solution or trying to come up with one that works for everybody.
So any questions on that? I find it very difficult to convince owners to give horses time off and implement groundwork. It is very difficult. I don't find it a difficult thing to do at all. But then again, if they're calling in a veterinary physio, then they're kind of expecting time off. But again, it depends how you explain it. So let's hope that further down the line we can explore that topic of why perhaps they should or could give time off. But it is difficult. It is difficult. If they call you in, they want a saddle, they're not going to want to hear that they can't have a saddle. And I've had a customer whose horse is recovering from ulcers, long reining recommended before a saddle fit due to muscle loss. Yeah, so becoming involved there in a clinical case. So yeah, it's good to keep checking back with them. How's the horse doing? if it's ready for a saddle, I'll come back and take a look. So that's a much more professional approach to be part of the team. And it's the way things are going at the moment. That's the trend we're heading for. Groundwork, any recommendation for words of wisdom that have got through to owners who just want to ride? Yes, I would say, I know this particular comment comes from someone who has not been on one of my rider evaluation and stabilization courses, but they could potentially learn to ride a bit better or to stabilize themselves a bit better, to be a more symmetrical load on the horse. So they could perhaps take the horse back a few steps. Quite often I have to say to people, okay, let's just pretend this is a 3-year-old we've got, and you are going to have to reback it. This horse has got some gaps in its training and you need to fill them in, or the horse's history may not be clear. So the best thing to do is to go right back to the beginning and reback them, just to find what the gaps are. That can be a really powerful way to get through to them. Or you can perhaps refer them to a video, because people, there's only so much information they can take in. But again, we'll cover this as a group as time goes on. Not all of this is going to be about professional practice. There will be a horse in there at some point. And yes, what I sometimes do is giving them a temporary saddle to see the development of the horse. It's like a rehab saddle to see how the horse is developing. That is brilliant. I do know a couple of fitters who do that. And I have asked a couple of manufacturers, please, can we have a rehabilitation saddle? Not something that costs thousands, something that costs hundreds. And yeah, I think I'm starting to see them coming through. But to me, the best rehab saddle is potentially a synthetic saddle. I never saw many problems with them. So yes, definitely that's another trend I can see us doing or heading towards in the future, is to supply temporary saddles. And I also suggest sometimes the same as an earlier commenter, long reining and properly lunging to relax the top line and build muscles back. Yeah, that's really good. I would say they must have the body work with that, because you cannot reset a posture. You cannot just put exercise into a horse that may be compensating, because all it may do is compensate some more. So reset with body work, then put the exercise into the new posture. Good. And also difficult when the owner or rider is simply not skilled or knowledgeable enough. Yeah, and that's a good reason to take them back to the rebacking process, because maybe the owner needs to fill gaps. So they may need an expert, or you might have a crash dummy in your network, someone who'll go in for 6, 8, 10 sessions and take the owner and the horse, or the rider and the horse, through some ground schooling techniques. So it's not impossible. Or what I might say to them is, well, okay, ride every other day. That's certainly what I do for rehab. Don't ride them every day of the week. If you have to ride, give them a day off in between for whatever reason. That works fairly well.